Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Thank you everyone for joining us today for the third event of Sikh Heritage Month Ottawa. This past year has been challenging for us all, but that just means that it's more important than ever to join together and celebrate Sikh Heritage Month. So thank you all for being here today. We are delighted to be joined by Amarpal Sidhu for our first of 4 history lectures that we have planned for this month. Amarpal Singh was born in Punjab, India, and he spent over 20 years working in the software industry before turning to his real interest in military history and the exploration and analysis of battlefields. His books on the First and Second Anglo-Sikh Wars have been very well received. Amarpal has also appeared and collaborated on history programs for several TV channels. So today's event is about the Anglo-Sikh Wars, and we will be taking questions at the end in about 45 minutes. So please type any questions that you may have throughout the presentation in the Q&A box, or feel free to raise your hand and open your mic at the end and ask your question verbally if you prefer. Thank you so much, and I'll hand it over to Amarpal Singh.
Hey, thank you very much. It's Amanreet Kaur, isn't it? Yeah, thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks to Hardik and is it just Noor and there's one other person I can't see their name, but thanks very much for organising this discussion and this talk. Yeah, brilliant. Right. Well, we've got about 40 minutes, and it's a huge topic, the Anglo-Sikh Wars. You can easily talk about each battle, for several hours, and the background to the wars as well. Let me just share my screen actually before we go ahead. So let me see if that works. Can you see my?
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Yeah. Can you see my PowerPoint, or can you see the whole screen?
We can see the whole screen.
Oh, okay. Let me just try and reduce that to. Oh, not quite sure how to do that. Anyway, I think we're okay. I'll just play the whole screen, so that's fine as well. Okay, well, like I'm saying, like I said, it's a huge topic. It's a really fascinating subject as well. It's probably, or arguably, the single most important subject, really, in Sikh history. How the Sikhs lost their kingdom. How Khalsa Raj came to an end. And it's in many ways it's quite similar to decline and fall of other empires. So I love reading history. Decline and fall of the Roman Empire, the Ottomans, whatever. There's always a huge and rich history there, which details, all the things that went wrong. And there's so many lessons to be learnt from that. In the case of the Sikhs, there was a lot of disunity. There was a lot of the wrong people, if you like, coming into power. There's a lot of intrigue, betrayal. There's a lot of division within Sikh ranks, a lot of personal ambition as well, a lot of jealousy, and all these combined, along with the fact that there wasn't a single strong man or strong woman that they could sort of rally around to destroy the empire, essentially. So they say you can learn a lot of lessons from history, and there's never a truer word said than that, really. So I'm conscious of the fact that we've only got 40 minutes, so I'm going to try and I usually talk too much, so let me know if I'm not if I'm sort of dragging on in one section or another. Yeah, let's try and get through both the wars, actually. So I thought I'd start off with the chronology about where the Anglo-Sikh Wars actually fit in. Both the Anglo-Sikh Wars were between 1845 and 1849. So if you look at the PowerPoint slide, you can find that they're essentially about 100 years before the British left India. And in fact, Punjab was actually the last sort of major territory that the British gained during their time in India. So Punjab was actually the last major expansion. Just starting off at the beginning, the British established their control in India in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey, and that was in Bengal. And about 22 years later, Ranjit Singh was born. Now he was the sort of central character in the Sikh empire story, as everyone knows. He became Maharaja in 1801. And in 1809, when he was 29, he actually signed a treaty with the British, which basically established the Satluj River as the border between the two empires. So the treaty was that the British would not expand north of the Satluj, and neither would Ranjit Singh expand to the south. And that's the way it stayed. I'm not sure if Ranjit Singh ever really wanted to be sort of close friends with the British, but that's the way it turned out. He was quite popular with the British. You know, all the governor generals that used to come to Lahore, the commanders in chiefs, the generals, officers and administrators of the British that used to visit him used to be very impressed with him. And, you know, they used to call him the Lion of the Punjab. And that's a moniker that they invented, really. And he, on his part, basically expanded his empire to the north and a little bit to the south and to the west. But he kept his part of the deal as well. He knew the British were pretty powerful, so he didn't want to risk it at that stage. And my guess is he probably was waiting for events to happen, and maybe he would have expanded south and taken on the British. And in fact, if he had survived, he actually died in 1839. If he'd actually survived till 1857, his chance of actually expanding throughout India would have come true, because that was when the great Sepoy Mutiny broke out in India. And unfortunately, he used to drink a lot, and that's basically what caused his demise. So you know, he would have he died at the sort of pretty young age of 59. You know, it was a drink that did him, and you could almost blame alcohol for the end of the Sikh Empire, if you like, in that sense. If he'd survived much longer, then the Sikh Empire wouldn't have fallen. But anyway, he died in 1839, and that's where the problem started. There was a whole sequence of new people on the throne. First of all was Maharaja Khadak Singh, who was his son, his oldest son. He was sort of replaced almost by Khadak Singh's son, Naunihal Singh. And unfortunately, both of them met with very suspicious deaths. So they sort of left the scene in 1840. And then you had a couple of other characters, you know, Maharani Chand Kaur, then Maharaja Sher Singh, who was another son of Ranjit Singh, taking over. And unfortunately, he got assassinated as well. And in 1843, Maharaja Dalip Singh became ascended to the throne with his mother Maharani Jindan Kaur effectively being, you know, the person in power. So that's what happened. But all this time, from 1839 to 1845, the Sikh army was gaining more and more influence, more and more control over what was happening in matters of government. Rightly or wrongly. I suppose from their point of view, there wasn't really any replacement for Ranjit Singh. You know, you get this all the time. You know, people like Alexander the Great dying. There wasn't really anyone to replace him, and the empire almost immediately breaks up. And that's the case with the Punjab as well. When Maharaja Ranjit Singh died, you had a whole host of sort of mediocre personalities sort of effectively taking over. None of them really strong enough to keep the country on an even keel. So as you can see from the chronology, 1845, that was when the first Anglo-Sikh War broke out. If I just go on to the next slide, by this time, two very sort of dodgy characters, if you like, had taken over the reins of power in Lahore. On the left, you can see Tej Singh, who was the commander-in-chief of the Sikh army. And on the right, you see Lal Singh posing in European armor in Lahore, and he was the prime minister. And these two, along with Maharani Jindan Kaur, effectively were the sort of nominal people in power. Now, what they didn't like was the fact that the Sikh army was seating and unseating anyone they wanted. So it was a little bit like, if anyone's ever read about Roman history, it's a little bit like the Praetorian Guard, who were the bodyguards of the Roman emperor. The Praetorian Guards would effectively seat and unseat anyone they wanted. If they didn't like a guy, they would assassinate him and put another person on the throne. So that's exactly what it was like in the Punjab. The Sikh army was effectively the kingmakers. Now, these characters, almost in fear of their lives, I think, they knew at some stage that they might be assassinated, decided upon throwing the Sikh army across the border with the British. And the reason for that was that if the Sikh army managed to defeat the British, they would get the credit for it. Effectively, they were giving the Sikh army something to do rather than dabbling in politics. So if they won, that's all to their credit. And if they lost, that effectively destroys the Sikh army. And these chaps were happy to work underneath the British. They had no sort of sense of nationalism, if you like. They'd rather be safe and secure with the British controlling the Punjab than being sort of nominal leaders, but with the Sikh army controlling things and assassinating who they pleased, or who they didn't like, rather. So that was the kind of straits that the country had come to. So if we move to the next slide, the excuse that they got was that the British were actually making some very aggressive moves. The British had seen the fact that the Punjab was in real trouble. It was in a sort of almost spiral of death, if you like, death spiral. They knew the state was collapsing, and they decided that there was some opportunities for them as well in this situation, perhaps a takeover of the Punjab, something that they wouldn't have countenanced when Ranjit Singh was around. But the situation had changed in the last 6-7 years. And they actually seized some villages that belonged to the Sikh Empire, and the British agent in control of the border area actually fired on some Sikh magistrates and administrators as well, crossing the river. And that was really the excuse that Lal Singh and Tej Singh made to throw the Sikh army over the border and start a war. And so there we have it. So, war breaks out, the First Anglo-Sikh War. The Sikh army crossed the river, I think it was about the 12th of December. And what ended up was 5 battles during this campaign. So we don't really have time to sort of go through all the nitty-gritty, unfortunately, but I'll do a quick sort of overview of several of the battles, just to give people some idea. It's a sort of taster to the First Anglo-Sikh War, events. the first battle that was fought between the two sides was at a village called Mudki, and you can actually visit Mudki, and in fact all the other places as well. They're all in the Indian side of Punjab now. You know, as you probably know, as everyone probably knows, Punjab was split during the you know, partition, and the battlefields of the Second Anglo-Sikh War are unfortunately on the Pakistani side now, so a little bit more difficult to visit, you know, unless you have you can get a visitor visa from Pakistan. But all these battlefields that were in the First Anglo-Sikh War, you can visit them very easily. They're very close to Firozpur, or three of them are anyway, Mudki, Firoz Shah, and Samrao. You can actually visit them all in one day. The other two, Badawal and Aliwal, they're very close to Ludhiana. So if you're ever in Ludhiana, do go there. You know, very, well, certainly I felt very emotional every time I go there. You know, it's great to visit these places. I always do a little bit of a pilgrimage when I go to India, to all these places. So anyway, back to the battles. Mudki was the first one, and it was quite a strange battle, actually. It was fought in the night, and in the middle of a very sort of jungled sort of place, you know, just a couple of miles outside Mudki, which might sound strange to everyone listening, because we don't really get many jungled areas anymore in Punjab, do we? It's all been all the jungles have been cut down, but in those days there was still a jungle there. So it was a very confused battle, fought in pitch dark in the middle of a jungle. There's huge amounts of dust being, you know, thrown into the air by cavalry movements. There's these very strange hillocks you get there, sort of sandy hillocks as well, which totally obscure the view. So it's fought in the most confusing of circumstances, and it pretty much ended in a draw. There was about 10,000 Sikh troops fighting against about 16,000 British troops. The British actually had heavier artillery, and they managed to push the Sikh troops back a bit, but it was effectively a draw. I mean, nobody, you know, there wasn't any sort of conclusive result to it. And in fact, the Sikh troops were pretty elated by that, because, you know, they'd never actually fought the British, and vice versa. The British had never fought the Sikh troops before. And the Sikh troops knew that, you know, they were outnumbered, but they actually managed to, you know, give as good as they got during the battle. And so they were quite, you know, morale was pretty high. You know, if the British ever meet the main Sikh armies, you know, they're really going to have some trouble. So that was Mudki. 3 days later, you had the very climactic Battle of Firoz Shah, which is the most, you know, one of the most famous battles in Anglo-Sikh history. And if we just move to that, well, that's Mudki, by the way. That's quite an accurate representation of the battlefield. You know, you can see some various trees here, and in fact, it was much more jungle than that in those days. Okay, well, Firoz Shah, the British commander-in-chief very confidently decided to attack the main Sikh army encampment at the village of Firoz Shah. And so if you look at the picture, you'll find, you know, you can actually see this is actually quite a good representation of what Firoz Shah looked like in those days. You can see the village there. There's a little tower there, a few other sort of houses there, but you can see hundreds of tents and you know, what would have been wagons and carts and you know, other camp equipment, basically organized into a square. So if I show everybody the map, you can actually see the Sikh army is in the blue at the top. You can actually see the Sikh camp in a rough sort of rectangle, if you like. In the middle were all the baggage of the Sikh army and the tents, and then the Sikh army had a sort of formed a line on all four sides. And this is what the British decided to attack. They decided to attack from the south and from the west and from the east as well. So the entire sort of bottom half of the Sikh rectangle, if you like. Things didn't go according to plan for the British. What the British commander-in-chief had thought was that he could actually beat the British or beat the Sikh army within an hour or two, and you know, be back to Mudki, where he'd left his baggage, the same night. You know, the British at this stage were quite used to easy wins all across India. You know, they were very strong. And, you know, for the last 40, 50 years, they'd never really had any sort of problem beating, you know, other Indian armies. But the Sikh army was different. Sorry, they got into a lot of trouble there. The battle started very badly for the British. The British guns opened up, the British artillery, and they soon found that the Sikh artillery were actually a lot better than them. And within the hour, all the British artillery had been destroyed. And so that was probably a sign for the British commander-in-chief, Sir Hugh Gough, that, you know, there's something going wrong. Nevertheless, he decided to attack and advanced all his army into the Sikh camp. And on the western side, in other words, on the left side of this map, the British were entirely repelled. You know, they suffered horrendous losses as they attacked the Sikh line, but they were pushed back. The other two brigades, the one in the south and to the east, did have more success, and they actually entered the Sikh camp. And you had intense fighting inside the camp from about 5 o'clock right up to 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock at night. So for that period of about, you know, 6-7 hours, I don't know if you can imagine that, but if I go back to that, you can see all the tents there. It's very difficult to keep any sort of formation. You know, there's tents everywhere, there's ropes everywhere, baggage carts, wagons. You know, it's essentially it's everyone for himself. So hugely confusing battle. Again, fought in the night. The British had attacked at about 4 o'clock, or started the cannonade at 4 o'clock, which was when sorry, I'm going back now, aren't I? Yes, which was when darkness was actually falling. You know, 21st December is the shortest day of the year. And even when the British were attacking, it was pitch dark. So if you can imagine, you know, fighting in the pitch dark with tents everywhere, it's everyone for himself, really. It was totally confusing. And that's the way it stayed in the fighting for those 5-6 hours. But what was happening was that the British had not brought enough ammunition, and the British soldiers were finding that they were actually running out of ammunition. So they actually were ordered back out of the Sikh camp, and the British actually formed a square, very much like the Sikh square. They formed their own defensive square, simply because they'd run out of ammunition. And so during that night, it was a very uncomfortable night for the British. Like I said, there's no ammunition. They hadn't actually brought any food for themselves. The British soldiers hadn't eaten for the whole day. There was no water. All the wells were in Sikh control. It's very cold. Punjab gets very cold in winter, and the British had brought none of their baggage. So the soldiers had no covering, no coats, no blankets, and they were trying to sleep in sort of sub-zero temperatures. So it was really bad. It was a very bad situation for them. What worked in their favor was that the Sikh commander, Lal Singh, had no intention of winning. And he actually pulled the Sikh army back on the verge of victory, really. You know, I often think, you know, if he'd just stayed loyal to his troops and actually attacked the British, it would have been a really famous victory, one of the most famous, you know, victories of all time, really. But unfortunately, it wasn't to be. And that was a big let-off for the British. You know, they realized that they had underestimated the Sikh army. And in fact, they had a second let-off the next day when a second Sikh army arrived. This was headed by Tej Singh, the commander-in-chief of the Sikh army. And he was like Lal Singh. He had no great intention of winning. And after firing a few guns, he ordered his men back across the Sutlej as well, when he could have attacked and beaten the British at that time as well. So the British were very, very lucky, and they had 2 let-offs in 2 days. And that's a sort of scene at Firozshah, very accurate scene, actually. A lot of the wagons in the encampment, the Sikh encampment, were on fire. So you can see the, you know, sort of fires lighting up the night, and you can see the British soldiers attempting to get some sleep in the intense cold. In fact, Gough wanted to retreat from Firozshah, actually, but decided, you know, just to chance it the next day. Essentially, his men were too tired. That's what his officers told him, that the men are too tired to retreat, so we're just going to have to take our chance tomorrow and just let the men rest here at Firozshah. And that's a picture of Firozshah today. I took this picture a couple of years back, and from where I've taken this shot to the village right in the distance there, this was a place where, you know, the heaviest fighting took place. So the Sikh line would have stretched across where you can see that chap with the yellow T-shirt, and the British would have been attacking from where I'm taking the shot. So this was where the thickest of the fighting took place, if you like. Although, you know, you can't tell that from looking at this picture now. The next battle at Sabrao, unfortunately for the Sikh army, Lal Singh and Tej Singh decided to split the army, and only half the Sikh army fought and were defeated. And that effectively ended the First Anglo-Sikh War, and you had what was called the Treaty of Lahore signed. And the Treaty of Lahore effectively partitioned the Punjab. Kashmir was separated. The area north of the Sutlej and east of the Beas River, basically the Jalandhar area, was annexed by the British. And this was actually the most fertile and the most sort of promising in terms of taxation area, the richest area effectively of the Punjab at that time. So that was a huge blow to the Sikh Empire. And there was a couple of other conditions, or several conditions rather, that the British insisted on. And there was quite a high sort of financial penalty as well, that the Lahore government had to pay 60 lakh rupees to the British as well. And most importantly, they reduced the treaty. In the treaty, it was agreed that the Sikh army would be reduced to about 32,000 men, down from 80,000-90,000 men. So the British were basically weakening the state as much as they could. So that's what happened in the First War. Nobody actually thought a second war would break out. I think I'm a little bit behind the time at the moment. It's 7:35, so I'll try and sort of finish off in the next 7-8 minutes, and which will leave us time for questions as well. But going back to the Second Anglo-Sikh War, nobody thought it would actually break out, but it did about 2 years after the First Anglo-Sikh War, and you had 4 battles in that war. Again, very much like the First Anglo-Sikh War, 1 or 2 of the initial battles were sort of skirmishes, very inconclusive battles, and the battle following those, just like Firozshah, Chilianwala, was an absolutely sort of iconic, very important battle, which the British again nearly lost. Again, I think the British commander-in-chief was overconfident, and he'd sort of underestimated the Sikh army, even though it had been heavily reduced by the British after the First War. And at Chilianwala, I'm just going to show everybody, whoops, just going to show everybody the map there of the battle. Essentially, half the British line, which advanced against the Sikh line, was thrown back. So you can see the various brigades there. The British are in the red, by the way. Pope's cavalry on the extreme right was thrown back in complete chaos, and so was Pennywhick's brigade in the middle there. About half the British army was thrown back. The other half sort of kept shape, but didn't have any particular success as well. And again, the battle was fought at night in complete confusion, and Sher Singh had a golden opportunity to win. He didn't actually realize, I believe, the complete chaos that the British line were in. And if he'd actually advanced when his line had repelled the British, I'm pretty sure that he would have achieved a victory. But he was quite cautious, and he always fought on the defensive. So that ended the Battle of Chilianwala, and at the next battle, the British commander-in-chief became almost too cautious. He actually waited for a second army from Multan to reach him with an extra, 15, 20,000 men, plus a huge amount of artillery. And in fact, the British artillery at the Battle of Gujarat, the final battle, completely outclassed and outgunned the guns that Sher Singh, the Sikh commander-in-chief, had. And it was a very conclusive victory for the British. In fact, they call it the Battle of the Guns. That's what it was called later on, simply because the British had such a sort of such a dominance in the guns in this battle. And unfortunately for the Sikh Empire, that sort of almost signaled the end of things, really. Maharaja Dalip Singh was asked to abdicate, to resign, and he was eventually taken out of the Punjab and found himself in England, and that's where he lived and died most of his life. And a similar sort of story with his mother, actually. She was quite sort of badly treated by the British in many respects. She was actually ejected from Lahore and taken to Gujranwala, held in prison there. Then she was taken to India. She managed to escape to Nepal, but later she joined her son in England, where she died. So that was almost the end of the Sikh monarchy, really. Dalip Singh had children, but none of them had their own children after that. Just a quick, I think I've got about 4 or 5 minutes. I just wanted to show everybody, if they ever visit the Punjab, you can actually see the British monuments there, to these battles. and they really are still in good shape, despite Indian efforts to sort of repair and maintain them. Usually you can tell all the very sort of cheap and sort of low quality work that sometimes happens in India. But on the left, that's the monument that the British put up at Firozshah to mark the battle. And the one on the right is Sir Brown. And this one's at another battle called Aliwal, which is very close to Ludhiana. And if you ever go there, just ask anyone in Ludhiana where Aliwal is, and this monument is just a couple of miles from the village itself. And this is the quite splendid monument that the British put up in Chilianwala. And I don't know if you can see that at the bottom. You can see sort of very long, sort of almost pathways of cement. Those are actually the British graves. So there's quite a large British graveyard there, and you've got these sort of walkways, or what looks like walkways, but they're actually graves of British soldiers that can be seen there as well. Like I said, this is in Pakistan. So if you ever go to Pakistan, do try and visit Chilianwala. And this is the Gurdwara at Mudki. I've had, like I said, every time I go to India and visit Mudki, I always go to the Gurdwara there. And it's always great to sit down with some of the oldies there and just talk about the Anglo-Sikh Wars. They love talking about that and all the treachery and, incompetence shown by the Sikh commanders. And there's also a Firozshah Museum there as well. If you ever go to Firozshah, which is very close to Mudki, you can actually visit the museum there. I'm not sure it's got that much to see. They've got a fair amount of British and Sikh, guns and weapons there. So there's that. It's very close to Firozshah. So if you visit Firozshah, definitely go to the museum as well. Okay, well that's the end of the discussion, really. Unfortunately, I couldn't cover everything in as much detail as I'd like. 40 minutes isn't a very long time. But if that's sort of whetted anyone's appetite about the wars, if they want to know more, and there's a huge amount of more detail involved in these wars and the politics that was involved in these wars, and what happened to the Punjab after these wars, in fact, as well. If anyone's interested, do check out my books, First Anglo-Sikh War, Second Anglo-Sikh War. And in fact, I've got a third book coming out soon, and that's on the Siege of Delhi in 1857. So if you're into, or if you like reading about the mutiny in India in 1857, that book will be released in July this year. So hopefully out soon as well. But that's it. Yeah, hopefully that wasn't too confusing for everyone. I hope I didn't rush through too quickly, and it, people sort of got a sense of these wars. But like I said, it's very difficult to cover everything in just a short time. So do Google these wars. Do read other books as well. It's all a part of our history, and like I said, it's arguably the most important part of our history, almost, because we lost our empire. So with that, I'll hand it back to Amanit Kaur, and she can take it from here now.
Well, thank you so much, Amarpal. I think I can speak for us all when I say that the Anglo-Sikh Wars were a fascinating part of history, and we've all learned so much from your talk. It was perfect. So we have quite a few questions, so let's just jump right into those from the audience. And once again, please type your questions in the Q&A box, or you can raise your hand and we will invite you to unmute. So a big question was, how do the residents in Punjab feel about having those larger British monuments, as you mentioned earlier, and their memorials in their villages? So was there any resistance when building them?
No, there wasn't. No, no. I think, the British treated, the Sikhs very well. They had a huge amount of respect for the Sikh soldiers, and in fact, as soon as the wars ended, they were busy actually recruiting the Sikh veterans into their force. And they were almost sort of bending over backwards to have Sikh soldiers in their armies. So they made all sorts of concessions that they probably wouldn't have made to other people. For instance, our soldiers wore the pagadi, and in their armies, they didn't allow that. They had the British cap and hats and things. But they said, yeah, you can wear a pagadi and you can have dari, beards, and essentially bending over backwards, really. But in terms of the monuments, no, there wasn't any resistance. And in fact, if you go there now, the people are quite proud that they live, on these battlefields, and the monuments mark them out as something important. So yeah.
So would you say that there was maybe more acceptance after the war?
Yes, I think that there was an acceptance of the defeat. I think, the Sikh soldiers probably realized that they just haven't got the leadership. If they had somebody like Hari Singh Nalua, for instance, who was one of the great Sikh generals of the 1830s, things might have been different. But at that stage, there wasn't really the leadership there. And these soldiers, being professional soldiers, they were quite happy to join the British, as any professional soldier would do, really. No professional soldier wants to go back to his village and till the soil and or become some sort of tradesman. That's his life. He's a soldier. That's all his training has been. So they were quite happy to join the British as well, and they really distinguished themselves as well. In the mutiny that came only about 8 years later.
All right, and on the note of leadership, wasn't Sher Singh quite a capable leader to succeed Ranjit Singh after his death?
Well, Sher Singh, there's two Sher Singhs actually. There was a Maharaja Sher Singh, who was, reasonably competent. He was a soldier. But the Sher Singh that actually led the Sikh army in the Second Anglo-Sikh War, he was very cautious. He always kept the Sikh army on the defensive. And, if you keep an army on the defensive, you're never going to win. So at Ramnagar, and then Sadalpur, Chilianwala, and then again at Gujarat, and even at Multan, where the war actually started, the war was always fought on the defensive. And again, I think due to excess caution. And, the best generals always take the chance when they've got it. They have that sort of sense that, now's the time to attack ourselves, counterattack. But he never had it, really. I think he was a mediocre general. I wouldn't say he was a bad general, but probably the wrong guy to have, I think. Certainly because, the British were so, powerful at that time. They actually, in terms of manpower and guns, they were very much more powerful than the Sikh army was in the Second War.
Right, and another question is, what role did Patiala and Faridkot Riasats play in these wars?
Well, Patiala, they essentially helped the British. During the First War, they helped the British as well. And again, in the Second War. In the First War, it was quite, well, I suppose in the Second War as well, actually. If they'd actually helped the Sikh army, it would have been very difficult for the British to actually supply their army in the Punjab. The reason for that is that Patiala falls in the middle of the supply line from Delhi right up to the Punjab. So it was essential for the British to have Patala on their side. But I think he, again, excess caution, just like with, Sher Singh. They may have had the feeling that, oh, the British are going to win anyway. They weren't really chances, actually. I think if they took the chance and actually allied themselves with the Sikh army, things may well have been different.
Right. And during the wars, was there any action in Kangra?
In where, sorry?
In Kangra.
Kangra.
Mm-hmm.
It's no, there wasn't. No. The British actually took over the Kangra region after the First Anglo-Sikh War, so that became part of their dominion. And essentially all the battles happened very close to Firozpur and Ludhiana in the First Anglo-Sikh War, and then in the Second Anglo-Sikh War, very close to the Jhelum River. And Multan in the south. So, Kangra is actually on, the opposite end of the country, opposite end of the Punjab. So, no, nothing happened there, unfortunately.
All right. And do we know of any correspondence between Lal Singh and Tej Singh and the British during the wars or before?
Yes, there is. Yeah. If you go to the National Archives in India, they have correspondence between them and Nicholson, who was actually the British agent in Firozpur at that time when the war broke out. And they actually asked him, what should we do? And how should we play where should we keep the Sikh army? We're not going to advance with them. We'll let you come to them. And essentially, they handed over all the initiative to the British. There's also British accounts, British first-hand accounts from British officers of Lal Singh and Tej Singh sending emissaries and people to the British camp for negotiations and to ask them what they should be doing. So it's pretty clear that their heart wasn't in it, and they wanted the Sikh army to lose. So we have a number of sources actually, which sort of confirm, the part they played in this war.
Right. And what happened to Lal Singh and Tej Singh after the first war?
Well, Lal Singh was sort of rewarded. Well, actually, they were both rewarded. Lal Singh was rewarded by being retained as Prime Minister, of the state. And same with Tej Singh as well. He was reconfirmed as Commander-in-Chief. Tej Singh actually wanted to be made a Raja himself, and he actually asked the British for a portion of the Punjab to be, sort of sliced off and given to him. But the British weren't interested in doing that. Lal Singh, he got himself into trouble later on. If he'd played his cards right, he would have he would have stayed on the right side of the British. But he actually tried to cause an issue in Kashmir, and the British ended up toppling him from power, and he was actually exiled out of the Punjab. And he lived in Agra for a while, actually, and then Dehradun, and on a pension, and disappeared into history. We don't really hear much from him after his retirement. Tej Singh, he actually offered the British help during the Second Anglo-Sikh War, which is weird, the Sikh commander-in-chief or the former commander actually helping the British, but there you go. And then again, he offered the British help during the Indian Mutiny as well.
So was there a reason why he offered help to the British? Like, did something change after the war or anything?
Well, it was really just to firm up his own power, really, and wealth. I'm guessing that both these guys, they weren't leaders essentially. When somebody isn't a leader, they're content to play second fiddle, and these people were content to have the British control the country and to essentially just serve underneath them, and that was it really. They liked the reward, they liked the sort of being patronized by the British as well. But they certainly weren't leaders, and that explains their conduct.
Right, and moving on to more of like the Sikh Empire note, how did the Sikh Empire usually justify the expansion of the empire?
You mean how would we justify the Punjab, the expanding itself?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I suppose, that's imperialism as well. So, the Sikhs were expanding their way through Punjab. It was slightly different from other sorts of imperialism in the sense that we were actually pushing out the Afghans. So when Ranjit Singh formed his empire, he was fighting against other Sikhs. You had the Sikh missile, the sort of division of Sikhs, if you like, at that time. But when he was expanding to the west, he was actually fighting against the Afghans, expanding all the way to the Khyber Pass. All that area from west of Lahore right up to the Khyber Pass was actually controlled by Afghans, and the same with Kashmir as well, the same with Multan as well. This was all Afghan controlled. So he was the first guy to effectively push out the Afghans, and sort of almost liberate the Punjab from any sort of external power. So that was the justification. I think we can say for his expansion. But yeah, it was imperialism, just like the British were trying to expand.
Right, and do you think that the British, so dissolving or sort of being the cause for the fall of the Sikh Empire, was it inevitable, or could there have been a different outcome, or could it have been prevented maybe in any way?
It could have been prevented. I think if we had a good leadership after Ranjit Singh. I was mentioning that Maharaja Kharak Singh took over after Ranjit Singh. His son Naunihal Singh was essentially built of the same material as Ranjit Singh. He was a very clever guy, very intelligent, very, very, very capable. And I think if Naunihal Singh had survived, the Sikh Empire would have survived as well. But unfortunately, he died in very suspicious circumstances. But even so, I think we had some great chances to beat the British. First at Firoz Shah, and secondly at Shilianwala. So, this idea that the British would have won, doesn't hold for me. I mean, if you read the first-hand accounts, British first-hand accounts, of officers and men on the ground, you actually get the real picture of how desperate these battles were. And, in one sense, how lucky the British were that the Sikh army was never asked to counterattack and advance against them. Otherwise, they would have been in real trouble.
Mm-hmm. And why didn't Maharaja Ranjit Singh ever take on the British himself?
Well, I think he thought that he wasn't strong enough. I think certainly during the early part of his empire days, he was busy consolidating himself in the Punjab, really, up to about 1820, 1830. He was still conquering Kashmir, Peshawar, Multan, and, being the first of a dynasty can be very difficult because you have so many sort of factions. The Sikhs were still sort of split up into these confederacies or missals, as they called them, and to keep all this together is very difficult. So his first and most sort of pressing issue was to actually consolidate the Punjab, and that's what he spent his time on. And I think maybe at some stage he thought he probably could take on the British, but he died too early for that. He died at the age of 59. During his last decade, I think he lost a lot of his energy as well. He took to I mean, he was always a heavy drinker. So that, his early days when he was actually riding out in front, in the front of his army and actually fighting himself, those that sort of energy and vigor that he had in his early days had sort of disappeared by that time. But he'd actually modernized the Sikh army so much that it was effectively as good, if not better, than the European armies of that time. So that was his sort of legacy to his successors. Although they couldn't sort of take advantage of that, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. And did the Sikh army assassinate any of Ranjit Singh's heirs?
Yeah, there was a lot of confusion. Several of his sons died, actually. As I mentioned, Sher Singh, there's Peshawar Singh, and I've forgotten one or two others, actually. Dalip Singh was actually his youngest son, and if you'd asked him or asked anyone during his lifetime if Dalip Singh would ever become Maharaja, they would have said no, because he had 4 or 5 sons ahead of Dalip Singh, older sons. But unfortunately, they all died in these struggles to get the throne. Really, it's a great shame. It's what can I say? Power attracts people. Power struggles are dangerous.
Yeah, and another question is, during the Indian Mutiny, did the majority of the Sikhs side with the rebels or the British because of the whole power thing as well?
Yeah, the Sikh veterans almost, wholeheartedly helped the British. And there were several reasons for this. First was that the Punjabis, the Sikhs, absolutely hated, the sepoys that the British used. When the British took over Punjab, a lot of these sepoys made a real nuisance of themselves all over the country, going around claiming that they'd beaten the Sikhs, basically, sort of boasting their way around the whole country, and giving a lot of problems to the locals as well. So they were actually hated, very much hated by the Punjabi population, not just the Sikhs, the Muslims and Hindus as well. So when the mutiny broke out, there was almost no sympathy for these people as well, at all. And in fact, there's various stories of Indian sepoys rebelling and trying to sort of make it to Delhi, but being harassed all the way by Punjabi villagers, and very few of them actually made it out to Delhi. The other thing was that the British treated the Sikh veterans really well. They wanted them in their force, and during the mutiny, almost all the recruits that they made during the mutiny came from the Punjab. Mostly Sikhs, but also Muslims, Hindus, Gurkhas. So yeah, there was this. By this time, there was a very strong relationship between the Sikh veterans and the British. So yes. Having said that, in my book, the new book, Siege of Delhi, I think I do mention that some Sikh soldiers actually fought with the rebels as well, but very few.
Right, and one last question is, what was the level of intelligence operations in the Sikh Empire, and how did these missteps impact the Anglo-Sikh Wars?
So are you talking about British intelligence or Sikh intelligence?
I think both.
Okay, well, the British knew exactly what was going on when they took over after the first Anglo-Sikh War. They had administrators going all over the Punjab, checking, the forts, the fortresses, the amount of ammunition, the guns that the Sikh army had. So they knew the situation exactly, actually. They had map makers going out all over the Punjab as well. Like I said, various administrators. So they knew exactly what was going on in the Punjab. From the Sikh side, I think it was less so. I mean, there was nobody in charge. People like Lal Singh, Tej Singh had no great interest in trying to, recover the state, if you like. So there was nothing really going on from the Sikh side, unfortunately. Having said that, we had the advantage, sort of home advantage, if you like. So, these battles were taking place in the Punjab, and there are accounts of villagers and various groups trying to disrupt British supplies reaching the British force. So there was to a certain extent some things happening intelligence-wise, but it could have been much more, I think. It comes back to leadership. We didn't really have the leadership during the Second Anglo-Sikh War that we should have had, or even the First War.
All right, well, thank you so much. That's all the time that we have for today, and we'll be sure to check out your books. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak and to be a part of Sikh Heritage Month Ottawa 2021. We'd like to end off today with some small announcements from the SHM Ottawa team. This year, we have partnered with the Manmeet Singh Bullard Foundation to help raise funds to sponsor Afghan religious minorities and to help settle them in Canada. So for more information or to donate, please visit our website, shmottawa.com, or the foundation's website, the msbf.ca. And a quick reminder that this Friday on April 9th, we will be having a Gatha and Q&A at 5 p.m. EST via Zoom as well. And the following day on Saturday the 10th, we will be hosting a kids history event at 11:30 a.m. EST and Big Talks at 3 p.m. EST. So to register for all of these events and to get the links for the upcoming events, please visit our website, shmottawa.com. Thank you so much. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Man tan tar har har man tar